Going on to some other topics here related to internet weather. First item is, we've been reporting for a while some denial of service attacks, basically an increase in denial of service attacks using SNMP, that's port 161 UDP. So we see this as source port 161 UDP because it's a reflection attack from SNMP servers that are on the internet. That activity seems to be relaxing a little bit. Not as significant as we'd seen in the past, but it hasn't really been that big of an issue in any case. And what I mean by that, to put this into context, I sort of overlaid the other reflective denial of service attack activity over the last 180 days in this graph here. And you can see kind of down here in the, the dark blue, that represents the contribution from SNMP activity, along with the other contributions from character generator, packet fragmentation, DNS reflection attack activity, NTP, that's port 123, as well as SSDP, that's port 1900 UDP. So not really big change. It seems to be relatively stable. We do actually see a little bit of a surge in activity here that was relatively recent, I think a couple of weeks ago. It looks like character generator was the bigger contributor, perhaps sort of a shift from the SNMP to character generator in this activity.
And I think character generator creates a lot of fragmented packets.
It will tend to create fragmented packets if done correctly, yeah. John, you reported on this last week. I think this is perhaps the third week of us reporting on this activity.
Still a mystery.
Scan sources, what we detect as scan sources on 4143 UDP as well as 4183 UDP. We're showing 30 days of data here, so it's relatively new activity starting around the end of March, near the end of March there. It appears to be P2P activity. And you had done a little bit of packet analysis on this to get some insight into what's going on.
I haven't been able to isolate any two devices talking to each other in any kind of peer-to-peer communication, though. I can't say that I've tried real hard.
Well, and there aren't that many contributors here,
right.
So the network's relatively small still. I mean, it's still in the thousands, but it's not relative to the size of the internet, relatively small. So it would be kind of a needle in a haystack in a sense.
Yeah, that's a little bit of the problem. I also did some botnet analysis just to see if is there anything other than peer-to-peer in the kind of traditional centralized command and control that we're used to looking for. So doing some net flow analysis, say, okay, throw away all the scanning activity they're doing. What else are they all talking to in common? I didn't see anything,
right.
Which is interesting. I mean, maybe not unexpected. I was kind of hoping I might find something, but didn't find anything right away. So. Yeah. That could be a visibility thing too. Maybe I didn't, have enough flow data or see, as many devices as I need to make that kind of correlation. But or maybe they only check in once a day, and I missed that time span.
For some reason, and this is just a hunch on my part, that I kind of reflect back on this Storm botnet from years ago and how it kind of behaved. You did a lot of analysis or tracking of that botnet back then. Any thoughts on how this? Any similarities to this one?
I don't know enough about it yet, to be honest with you. This is still a little bit of a mystery to me.
Yeah.
I mean, the Storm botnet we did, in some of these peer-to-peer botnets, you'll find that they, whoever runs them compromises, a large set of these lower tier ones, these devices that can participate. And then when they identify that some of these participants actually have direct internet access and they can act as kind of a command and control, they'll elevate those to like an upper echelon tier as a more privileged part of the botnet. And Storm did that. There's another one that did that too that's escaping me right now. I want to say actually like one of the Zeus Game Overs or one of those. Somebody had a peer-to-peer component in one of the Zeus.
That's correct.
We did have like higher level nodes, like centralized.
Yeah, vaguely remember something about that.
Or proxies,
maybe there's something like that here, but we don't even really know what this is, to be honest with you.
Yeah, well, and I think this is fundamentally one of the challenges when you have these Internet of Things kind of scenarios, and they don't have any virus, and so the antivirus vendors aren't picking it up. They're not sitting in front of a firewall, and so the firewall vendors aren't picking it up. And so it's kind of hidden for a period of time until we can get a little bit of handle on this one. So
yeah, and the other thing that's interesting about it is it's a wide array, as far as I can tell, of different types of IoT devices. It's not, a particular vendor model or a small set of vendor models. It seems like there's quite a large array of different types of devices, which makes me kind of scratch my head: is how does somebody know how to compromise so many of these different types of devices?
Those ports 4143 and 4183 may not be the infection vectors themselves. They just may have chosen those for the peer-to-peer.
Right, agreed. But when you actually look at what those devices are that are participating, if you poke them and do some fingerprinting, you'll see that they're all different. They're all very different types of devices,
different things, so.
different manufacturers. So I don't know what to make of that yet.
All right. So just another observation about this. I think, John, you had pointed this out last week as well. It's still relatively consistent. That is, the 4143 seems to be very much centered around the United States, whereas the 4183 basically in other parts of the world. It seems like there's been a little more smearing between the two, perhaps. And I used a larger address sample in this case than you did last week, so perhaps that's a factor associated with this. Looking at the top 10 most probed ports at the top of the list here, port 22 TCP. Well, we've kind of already had a little discussion about that and some of the implications associated with it. Followed by 135 TCP, that's still going strong as we've been reporting for many weeks now. 53 UDP has jumped up a little bit, so we're going to take a quick look at that. I think it's mostly related to denial of service attack activity. There were actually a couple of scenarios that contributed to this, so we'll talk about that in a moment. 443 TCP, that also moved up, but I wouldn't describe it as a significant anomaly or change in the behavior that relative to what we've seen in the past. Port 80 TCP, it's web 445 TCP, a regular on the list here. And then the 1433 Microsoft SQL database, 3389, that's a remote desktop protocol. 8080 TCP, we're going to take a little bit of a look at that later on in the context of sources doing the probing. And then we'll also take a look at port 23 later as well.
You know, I'm wondering, have we ever seen 443 have a higher volume than 80? I always kind of assumed in my head that 80 and 443 scanning were maybe looking for the same kinds of vulnerable software, simply one under HTTP and one under SSL.
Yeah, I think the one of the things with 443 is it's climbed in terms of the number of probes, partly because of vulnerabilities like Heartbleed and Poodle and Ghost, and so there's a lot of, it's not necessarily even malicious scanning per se. You can't tell from a probing point of view, even if you're on the receiving end of it. But there are a lot of researchers that are running around and probing things, and so that contributes to the change here, where they're not probing on 80, they're probing.
That's a good point.
Exclusively on 443.
Well, and there may also be, there are more sites that are forcing, folks to go to HTTPS rather than HTTP. Well, so that may also contribute to some of that.
That's true.
Flip-flop.
That's true. As I mentioned, port 53 UDP climbed quite a bit here, and there are actually two contributing factors here. Some of it is related to reflective denial of service attacks. So on the request side, if there's a spoof source, if it's going out to and sending requests out to lots of DNS servers to get responses back to to that target, that will look like scanning activity in the analysis. And then the other factor that's here is I think we've seen some cases where there have just been source addresses that are basically a spoof source, most likely, where they're just spraying out to an address block that they're targeting. So, I mean, I think this is significant if you are subscribing to a DDoS mitigation service, that you have the capability to be able to protect address blocks, because if they're all sort of homed off the same circuit, the attacker can spread the attack across all the addresses on that block and to be able to try to fill up the circuit. And that appears to be the case that they're doing in a couple of the attacks here. I think notably the spikes that you're seeing. And then, as I mentioned, port 23 has moved down in the list. We had seen it much farther up on the list, and so I thought it'd be worth pointing out. This is actually looking at the number of probes we're seeing on port 23 for the last 180 days. We are relatively low compared to some of the other activity, but what I really wanted to sort of point out is this trend that we've seen over the last several weeks, where there's a spike in the activity and then this deterioration, which is sort of a telltale sign of a botnet, where lots of destinations or targets have been told to do some scanning activity, and over time it sort of deteriorates. And these little spikes that are in here are actually, I think, researchers that are kind of probing around. I'd have to go back and validate it, because there are actually some what I'll describe as malicious actors doing the same sort of thing. Looking at the most sources doing the probing, we have at the top of the list port 445 TCP, so that had been taken over by port 23 some time ago, but 445 is back at the top of the list, followed by port 80 TCP, and then we see port 23 that's moved farther down the list. And then we're also seeing the port 4143 and 4183 in the list as well. Last that we'll mention here, but not least, is port 8080 TCP. And John, you had brought up 8080 TCP last week.
I did.
You had showed 30 days where there was a clear, ramping up activity. So I just thought I'd give a little bit of a different perspective, looking back 180 days, actually 90 days we're looking at here. And it is true, most of these are from China, although I think the demographic actually may be a little bit misleading. So I think you'd noted that most of the probes were from China. Actually, most of the sources are pretty well dispersed. And so that was one of the things that,
okay.
one of the
That's
observations
interesting.
is just looking at, in terms of the number of sources,
The Chinese probes were more aggressive than
the Chinese
the
probes
other
have
sources.
tended to be
Right.
more aggressive, but there are lots of other places, and it's very widespread.
Right,
So perhaps could provide a geographic map if this continues in this state next week. But also, it's also interesting to see that there's sort of been this long trend of deterioration and then a quick growth in activity, and that's continuing forward as well.
It'll be interesting to
Clearly
see if that
indicating a
decline
botnet.
slopes down again over the next, whatever,
Right.
4 weeks or so.